Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We'll take just a few seconds to wait for people to join us and connect. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining. I see that people are still joining us. We have 42 people now on the call. Thank you so much for joining. Good morning, everyone. So we will get started. We have a pretty packed agenda for today. Thank you again for joining us on today's webinar, SBT update on recent evolutions and growing interests of the financial sector. This is a webinar organized by CO2.Dierckx part of South Pole in collaboration with the CDP. So thank you so much for your help and support. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Your mic are all off, so you will not be able to speak during the presentation. And actually, we will be running a Q&A session at the end of this event. So please write your question in the chat. You have a chat function in your control panel. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them in the chat throughout the whole presentation. I see that my screen is not moving. Just give me a second to check that. Okay. Well, on the agenda for today, we will be starting with a presentation from Kenza Taoufic from the CDP. Kenza will give us an update on the Science-Based Target Initiative. So I'll let her introduce herself. Then we will have a few testimonials from financial players on their growing interest in the CDP, sorry, in the SBT initiative. So we have Viviana from Astorg Partners and Florent from Belfius. And then we'll be, as I said, running the live Q&A at the end. As a reminder, please type your questions in the chat and we'll be starting right away. Kenza, please take it away.
Thanks very much, Fanny. I'd like to share my screen, so if possible, I will try to do that now. So let's see. Great. I think everyone should be able to see my screen now. Please let me know if that's not the case. But I am very happy to be here today. Thank you very much, CO2Logic, for the invitation to participate in this event. As mentioned by Fanny, I'm part of the CDP Commit to Action team, and that's the team responsible for corporate engagement on behalf of the SBTI. And my focus is the European region. I'm happy to be here today to give you an overview of what is the Science-Based Target Initiative, what we do, and of course, give you an overview of the most important things that you need to know when it comes to setting science-based targets. So to reach that goal, we'll start with defining science-based targets, then how to set SBTs, and finally, we'll look into the changes that have been planned and announced by the SBTI in the recent past. So on to our first item, what are science-based targets? But of course, before we dive into that, I'll give you a brief introduction as to who the initiative is. So it is a body that was founded in 2015 as a collaboration between 4 partner organizations, including CDP, the World Resource Institute, the UNGC, and WWF. And the aim of the SBTI is to drive ambitious climate action in the private sector by enabling companies to set emissions reductions targets, which are based on science and also consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And as you can see on the slide, the initiative has had very strong traction with now more than 2,200 companies in total that have joined the initiative. And about half of those companies have committed to align their reductions with a 1.5-degree future. So I'll move on now to briefly explain what science-based targets, or SBTs, are exactly. SBTs are short to medium-term corporate emissions reductions targets that are in line with the level of decarbonization needed to limiting global warming to within 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And they are also a key tool to prepare for and accelerate the transition to a zero carbon economy. So in simple terms, SBTs help companies determine how much and how fast they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And this really means that they are the stepping stones that companies need to take on the way to the long-term goal of net zero. And while this long-term goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050 acts as a North Star for strategic decision-making, these 5 to 10-year science-based targets ensure that companies are reducing direct and indirect emissions at the pace needed to achieve this long-term goal. And of course, annual disclosure on progress demonstrates to different stakeholders that the company is on track. But why do companies set science-based targets? What are the drivers behind? So firstly, it is to seize and take advantage of opportunities within the low carbon transition. So for example, by innovating on the development of low carbon products and services. It is also to anticipate regulatory and policy developments. So we are seeing more and more ambitious climate targets that are being announced, and these will over time become the norm. So by setting a science-based target, your company can stay ahead of the curve on regulation and mitigate transition risks. Additionally, there is inherent competitiveness behind the low carbon transition. For example, minimizing energy or emissions related costs. And finally, and probably more importantly, it is to address expectations from stakeholders, including customers, but specifically investors who are expecting companies to have these kind of robust targets in place in order to future-proof the business for the low carbon transition. So I'll just provide an overview of the journey itself. The first step for companies is the commitment, and I'll talk a little bit more about the different commitment options in the next slide. But once your company commits, this basically kicks off a 24-month period where the company will start working and developing the targets. Submit the targets once it's ready to the SBTI for validation and announce the targets publicly. And once the SBTI approves the target, that's where the real work starts for companies, and they need to implement, but also track and disclose their progress against the target. So let's look into the commitment options. There are 2 ways to commit to the SBTI, the new standard commitment letter and the SME route. Through the first one, so the standard commitment letter, companies commit to setting near-term targets, so 5 to 10-year science-based targets. And as an option, they can choose to commit to setting long-term net zero targets. And by committing to this additional option of net zero, companies are also part of the Business Ambition for 1.5 Degree campaign and the UNFCCC Race to Zero campaign. The SME route, on the other hand, is available to all small companies that fit the SBTi's definition of an SME, which is a non-subsidiary independent company with fewer than 500 employees. So how do companies, or how can they develop science-based targets? So once the company has made a commitment, they will have to get to work on the second step of actually developing and setting the target. So how can you start with this? The first step is for you to understand your emissions and quantify them. So a greenhouse gas emissions inventory is required by the SBTi, and the initiative asks that companies calculate the inventory in line with what the greenhouse gas protocol says. On the slide, we can see the breakdown of emissions across different scopes, depending on where within the value chain they lie. An important note here is that we require companies to complete a scope 3 screening. And if this screening shows that 40% or more of the total emissions come from scope 3, then a scope 3 target is required. So once the company has a complete greenhouse gas inventory, then they can start the target setting process using the SBTi criteria and recommendation document that is available on the SBTi website. I will give you an overview of the 6 most important criteria today, but I would just like to note right away that a new set of criteria has been released in October of this year, and this will come into force in July of next year. And I will get back to this piece at the end of the, towards the end of the presentation. So let's look into the 6 most important criteria. The first one is the level of ambition, and the minimum level of ambition for scope 1 and 2 is a well below 2-degree alignment. And the SBTi has been encouraging a 1.5-degree alignment already since 2019, and this will be implemented officially in the new criteria that will become mandatory next year. The second one is the progress criterion, and the SBTs need to be forward-looking. The boundary criterion is asking companies to set targets that are covering at least 95% of company-wide scope 1 and 2 emissions, so only a maximum of 5% combined can be excluded. In terms of time frame, the SBTs are currently 5 to 15 years into the future from the date that company submits their target for validation, but this is also going to be shortened to 5 to 10 years in the new criteria, and I'll give more details later on. In terms of reporting, we ask companies to annually disclose their greenhouse gas emissions inventory and progress against the target in a public way. And finally, as I mentioned previously, companies need to conduct a full screening of their scope 3 emissions. And if that screening shows that 40% or more of total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions come from scope 3, then the company is asked to set a target for scope 3 as well. So let's look a little bit closer into the scope 3 requirements. The first thing I would like to mention is that the SBTi provides more flexibility around scope 3 targets than scope 1 and 2, both in terms of boundary and level of ambition. So the very first important part where we offer more flexibility for scope 3 targets compared to scope 1 and 2 is the boundary of the target. For scope 1 and 2, as mentioned before, the boundary is 95%, whereas for scope 3, this needs to cover 2/3 or 67% of the scope 3 emissions. And this is really to account for the fact that most companies, even those that have started their journey already 10 years ago, struggle to accurately calculate and drive down emissions across the entire value chain. So we really want to see companies start their journey, try to understand their own value chain, identify hotspots that they can act on later. The second important part is the level of ambition, and I will be explaining this in a couple of slides on the different methodologies used to set science-based targets. So for scope 1 and scope 2, there are two target setting methods that exist. On the left, you see the absolute-based approach, and here companies are asked to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the same linear annual absolute reduction rate than the IPCC asks the global economy to reduce by. On the right-hand side, we have the sector-based approach, or SDA, and this is based on sector-specific pathways that are developed by the International Energy Agency, and these pathways take into consideration both historical developments within that sector, as well as future projections and technological and innovation potential. And the goal is then to define an intensity path that all companies within that homogeneous sector will be converging towards. Currently, companies in all sectors apart from oil and gas can set science-based targets aligned with the SBTi criteria. And the most commonly used method is the absolute-based approach, which is used by 4 out of 5 companies with approved science-based targets. And this can be explained by the fact that the sectoral approach, or SDA, is only available for specific sectors. So let's look at these available SDAs. The SBTi has developed various sectoral methodologies or guidance for high impact sectors, and others are still being developed. On this slide, we can see a quick overview of what methods are available at the moment. But generally speaking, most sectors can set targets with the absolute-based approach, except from the power generation sectors that is compelled to use the SDA. Oil and gas companies will need to wait for the sector guidance to be available before they can get their targets validated. The aviation SDA, for example, has been released this year in August, and others are on the way, such as the shipping, the flag methodology, so agriculture and forestry, and a couple of others. For more information on the available methodologies, I invite you to check the resources linked at the bottom of this page, who give a good overview of what's available. But the key takeaway here is that all companies, when there's an SDA available, are free to choose between absolute or SDA. Let's look into scope 3. So as I mentioned before, there's more flexibility around scope 3 target setting. So let's see what options are available. There are 4 methods that can be categorized into buckets. So the first bucket is for a company to set its own target, and the other one is for a company to not set their own target, but ask the suppliers of that company to set science-based targets themselves. The first option is the absolute-based approach, like the first scope 1 and 2. However, here we require a level of ambition that is lower than for scope 1 and 2. So it's currently a 2-degree alignment, which translates as a 1.23% absolute reduction per year. Just to note here that the scope 3 minimum ambition will also increase with the new version of the criteria. The second option is to set intensity targets, which are either modeled on the sector decarbonization approach for setting physical intensity targets, or using the economic-based approach, which is a 7% year-on-year reduction per unit of added value. The third option available is to set physical intensity targets based on the physical indicator of your choice. That leads to a 2% intensity reduction per year, but at the same time, these targets cannot lead to absolute emissions growth. And in addition, or instead of these options, companies can choose to ask their own suppliers or customers to set science-based targets. So under this approach, companies commit to having a specific percentage of suppliers to have set their own science-based target within 5 years from the date that the company submitted their targets to the SBTi for validation. So it's really using, the power of supply chain to cascade down the climate action. This methodology makes sense, for example, if the portion of the emissions that come from category 1, purchased goods and services, is high, but it does not, or it is not recommended when the majority of these emissions come from tier 2 suppliers or suppliers even further removed from the reporting company, as it might be a bit more difficult to exert influence on them. I'd like to emphasize here that no matter which target setting method or approach is applied by a company for setting their scope 3 target, they will need to work on engaging the suppliers in order to drive down their upstream emissions to meet their target. And with many companies having a big share of their emissions in scope 3, more and more companies across the world start tackling this really important portion of the emissions by directly engaging and collaborating with their suppliers on ambitious target setting and on emissions reductions. So to conclude this second part, I would like to say a few words on the SME route. The full target validation process guarantees the robustness of companies' targets by having this validation step that I mentioned previously. However, going through the full SBTi validation process can be an iterative and relatively resource-intensive process for which smaller companies often lack capacity. So to address this specific barrier faced by small and mid-sized companies, in early 2020, the SBTi introduced a streamlined route to approve science-based targets for SMEs. It basically enables them to bypass the initial stage of committing to set a science-based target and to immediately set a science-based target for their scope 1 and 2 emissions. And they do this by choosing from one of the predefined target options that are available in the SME target setting form. So unlike larger companies, the SBTi does not require SMEs to set a target for their scope 3, but we ask them, and they must basically commit to measure and reduce their scope 3 emissions. On the right-hand side of the slide, we can see the two predefined target setting options which an SME is presented with in the target setting form. So let's now move on to the final piece of the presentation on the new criteria and the net zero standard. In the past few months, many changes were announced by the SBTi, including the unveiling of a new SBTi strategy. As you know by now, the journey of the SBTi started in 2015 before the Paris Agreement, and back then science was saying that we needed to keep warming to within 2 degrees. The target setting framework of the SBTi was based on that trajectory, but over time, this has changed, particularly after the publication in 2018 of the IPCC report. The aim now is 1.5 degrees and no longer 2 degrees. So ever since, the 1.5 degree alignment has become the new normal for companies to set SBTs. and it is currently the most common temperature companies choose to set their targets. To give you an idea, about 70% of all validated targets in 2021 were aligned with a 1.5 degree future. So as a result of this, a decision was taken to raise the minimum level of ambition across all 3 scopes. And the SBTi has actually developed a new set of criteria, which is now version number 5 of the criteria that was published on October 28th this year. This means that all submitted targets will need to align with this new version of the criteria from 15th of July 2022 onwards. So let's take a closer look at what has changed. On the left, we have version V 4.2, and on the right, we have the new version, so version number 5. When looking at scope 1 and 2, the boundary has not changed. So it is still a 95% coverage of emissions. The minimum level of ambition, however, is increased from well below 2 degrees to a 1.5 degree alignment. The time frame also is changing due to the increased urgency. It is 5 to 10 years instead of 5 to 15 years. When looking at scope 3, the boundary stays the same, so it's still 67% emissions coverage. However, ambition has also increased from 2 degrees to well below 2 degrees. And the time frame has been updated, and similarly to scope 1 and 2, it is also 5 to 10 years. I'd like to mention that companies do not need to wait until the July 15th of next year to use this version of the criteria to set targets, and they are very welcome to already align with this version. And this version number 5 is also important because companies that wish to set net zero targets will also need to comply with this version. So this actually brings us to the net zero standard. So the first question is, why did we actually go through this process of developing the new net zero standard? For the past 2 years, the SBTi has been working on defining net zero as a concept and developing a framework that provides the necessary criteria and practical guidance to set net zero targets. And that's because there was no consistent standard for companies to set net zero targets, despite the increasing number of companies that have announced their net zero pledges. And despite the fact that we have seen a huge increase in net zero pledges, we have actually noticed that the net zero targets that were announced differed across 4 dimensions. The first one I will mention is the climate scope. So some companies or some targets set by these companies only included carbon dioxide, for example, while others included all the greenhouse gas emissions. The next dimension where we see different levels is the scope of activities that are covered. So some targets included a company's own operations, some included all of the value chain. Apologies. The third dimension where we see differences is the mitigation strategy used to reach net zero. So some are just focusing on emissions reductions, some are looking at avoided emissions, others even negative emissions such as offsetting. And the fourth dimension is the time frame. Some are very short term, even 2020, and others are 2060, which is well past the 2050 deadline. So there's a very huge variety and lack of understanding on of when is the right time to be setting a net zero target. And because of these huge variations, there has been a lot of criticism on net zero as a concept. Some of this criticism has been targeted to the towards the incomplete boundary. So The net zero standard tries to address this by including all of the value chain emissions within the target. The second criticism is that net zero targets can be used as an excuse by companies to delay action. And the net zero standard includes near-term targets, which ensure short-term action. The third point is that targets can be used as a deterrent on actual mitigation of emissions. So some companies focus in on offsetting only rather than reducing emissions. And the net zero standard puts strong guardrails for companies to be reducing emissions at the right speed to get to net zero by 2050. And the final one is the lack of accountability. So the net zero standard tries to address this through the validation of net zero targets, but also companies are required to report on emissions annually, on an annual basis. The SBTi will also be introducing a more advanced measurement and verification standard, which I will mention very shortly at the end of the presentation. So let's look at the net zero standard itself. There are 4 key elements that make up the net zero standard framework. The first one is to set a near-term science-based target, and this is what we all know as the regular 5 to 10 year science-based targets to drive down emissions. And these have to be in line with 1.5 degree pathway. We have just added the term near term to this to make a distinction between short and long term. And second element is to set a long-term science-based target, and this is the new science-based target that the SBTi has been working on over the last several months to help companies determine how much they need to reduce emissions to be in line with the global net zero scenarios. And these targets also need to be aligned with 1.5 degrees and must be achieved by latest 2050. The third element is a recommended element, not required, but we feel that companies in the transition to net zero should take action outside and beyond their science-based targets to mitigate emissions. And it is a new term basically for what companies previously called offsetting. And it would be actions that companies take on top of their science-based targets to help society move to this net zero state. The last element of the net zero standard is that companies have to neutralize any emissions that remain when they reach their long-term science-based targets. Here we can see on the diagram, it is represented by the light blue square, where basically the dark blue and the purple piece have to be balanced out to neutralize the remaining emissions, and that's done by carbon dioxide removal and storage. All right, so to follow on from the net zero standard, we have planned 3 projects to help tackle some of the challenges to net zero. The first project we will be working on is the beyond value chain mitigation. We understand that it is important for companies to have clarity on how to take credible mitigation actions beyond the value chain. So, and actually many companies are looking to the SBTi for answers on this. So we're currently exploring different models to incentivize companies to do it in a credible and robust way. And this work is ongoing, and there will be more communication about this in Q1 of next year. But in the meantime, the SBTi has developed beyond the value chain FAQs that I invite you to refer to for some more information. The next project is the Net Zero Value Chain project, and this is basically trying to address some of the challenges around Scope 3. And the SBTi is looking at different Scope 3 target setting methods that companies can use, and we will be working on this in 2022. And finally, another project closely linked to the net zero standard is the MRV project. And the purpose of this project is to make sure that targets are reported in a correct and transparent way. So the SBTi has created documents to provide a comprehensive understanding of the criteria. 4 key resources are available already. The first one is the Getting Started Guide, which shows a step-by-step how you can set net zero target to be in line with the net zero standard. The second one is the standard itself that provides criteria and guidance and recommendations for net zero targets. The third is the criteria as a standalone document. And finally, we have the tool, the net zero tool, that helps calculate targets in line with the criteria. I also invite you to check our wide variety of resources that are available on the website to support you in your target setting journey, including different tools, guidance documents, and online training. So thank you for your attention, and I will now hand over to Eric for introduction on the growing importance of the science-based targets in the financial sector. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Kenza, for your crystal clear explanation on what the SBT is, what it represents, and what is waiting ahead of us with the net zero targets and other initiatives you're launching. I think it's super interesting. So hi, everyone. My name is Eric. I'm the head of sustainable finance and risk and opportunities for CO2 Logic in France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And as part of this webinar, we found it also interesting for you to hear first-hand insights also from financial players on why science-based targets are increasingly important for them. So I'm very happy and proud to introduce Viviana Occhionorelli from Astorg Partners, and also Florent Istas from Belfius as head of strategic transformation. Both of you, thanks very much for making some time to explain your insights. I have one single question for both of you. And why is it that science-based targets are increasingly important for you? If you could cover that in 5 to 7 minutes, both of you, well, each one receives 5 to 7 minutes, obviously. And then afterwards, we can hand over the floor to the participants for asking their questions. I hear there are a lot of questions for Kenza already. Please, we will answer those after Viviana's and Florent's interventions, where we will leave room for these questions ahead. Viviana, the floor is yours to have your particular insights on SBT. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you, Eric. And thank you for organizing this webinar. It's so interesting and useful. So really, thanks for that. So my name is Viviana Occhionorelli. I work at Astorg. Astorg is a private equity company which is headquartered in Paris. I'm head of sustainability. So Astorg invests in healthcare, software, and industrials. We have around 20 companies and 30 billion of assets under management. So why the science-based targets? So first of all, so we have a lot of pressure coming from institutional investors. So our investors, pension funds, for example, for them, climate action is a top priority. So we really want to make sure we are transparent about the carbon emissions coming from our portfolio companies, and we are serious about setting climate targets. And then we have our companies, our portfolio companies, who have pressure from their own customers, sometimes large companies who actually want information about the greenhouse gas emissions from their suppliers, and want their suppliers to have, for example, a science-based target or to do the CDP assessment. And then, as you know, the regulatory environment. So we have plenty of regulations, especially this year. I mentioned the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and others, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So many regulations coming from the European Commission, pushing us, but also our portfolio companies, to be transparent about carbon emissions and also having long-term targets to reduce their carbon emissions. So a lot of pressure coming from a lot of stakeholders. And then, of course, we are part of international initiatives like the the Climate Initiative International, all kinds of initiatives which are, gathering the industry actors together to set climate targets. And it all started with initiatives like this, like the Climate Initiative International, and where it started months ago. The collaboration together with the Science-Based Targets Initiative to set up a guidance for the private equity sector. And for us, this was a huge opportunity. And why is that? Because of course, for a PE company, it's very difficult to set a carbon reduction target covering all the investments, because as you can imagine, our portfolio changes over the years. So we buy companies, but then we also exit companies in a time frame of between 3 and 5 years. So our portfolio changes constantly. There were no rules before to have a portfolio target. So we saw this as a great opportunity together with other PE firms to set a target at portfolio level. Of course, so far we've been working with our companies to set science-based targets individually with the help of CO2 Logic, which has been of great support with our companies in the last 3 years to calculate their carbon emissions and to help us, to prepare us for this journey. So it happened in November 2021. We got our first science-based target validated. And so our science-based target is actually to have to cut our own emissions for scope 1 and 2 by 50% by 2030, and to actually have all of our investments, so 30% of our investments having science-based targets by 2025, and 100% of our investments having science-based targets by 2030. So this was our target. It has been validated. So this is going to change the way we work with our companies. It's going to change our process. So first of all, we will need to push further, and we will need to push faster our companies to collect data about their greenhouse gas emissions right immediately after we close a deal. And then we will have 2 years to have our companies setting a science-based target. We will include also this requirement as part of our shareholder agreements. So this will change also the way we work with our portfolio companies. We will increase training and support to our portfolio companies to help them in setting these targets. And so this is a great commitment. It's been a great opportunity to have this guidance, setting rules, clear rules and requirements for private equity companies to set targets to drive climate action in their portfolio. And I really want to take the opportunity now to thank all our portfolio companies for all this great work that has been done so far on climate action, and thanking also CO2 Logic for supporting us over the years to prepare us for this journey. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Viviana. I think it's pretty clear also why it's important for you and how you can play a role to support companies you invest in reaching those science-based targets. So it's interesting to see both of these sides of the medal. So thanks a lot. So we heard it from a private equity. Florent, how is it at Belfius Bank as a retail bank on science-based targets?
Yes, so hello everyone. So thanks, Eric. So, let me start by sharing with you why is sustainability increasingly important for us at Belfius. Today, sustainability is really in the core of our vision. So I'm head of strategic transformation for corporate and public customers. And my role is really to define what do we want to achieve in the coming 5 years. And one of the key strategic assets for us is really sustainability. Why? It's part of our purpose. Belfius aims to be meaningful and inspiring for its customers, meaningful and inspiring for the society. And what is more meaningful today than sustainability? Probably not much. I must be fair, it's also because, we have backwinds from the regulators. A bit like Viviana said, we also need to be increasingly transparent around our financing. What do we finance? Is it green enough? And if it's not green enough, at some point we will need to set apart more capital, more equity for that. So those drivers pushes us to engage into the ESG dialogue or sustainability dialogue with our customers. We do so for a few years already with larger customers, through what we call green framework, what we call sustainability linked loan, but that works very well for large players, large corp. Our ambition is really to bring sustainability and to support all our customers in their sustainability journey. And to do that, we are now putting together a VP together with CO2 Logic. So thanks for the support on that. A VP which we aim to bring to all our corporates, including the smaller ones. And there are two axes again in that VP. The first one is what we call green financing, green loans. So we will develop VPs with, which are extremely attractive to finance green investments of our customers. So purely green investments such as, I don't know, a green rooftop, solar panels, electrical cars, offshore energy solutions, and so on. So all that will be done through what we call green bonds and green loans. But next to that, we really want to help all our customers develop their own ESG strategy. And how are we going to do that? By developing what we call a sustainability-linked banking product for all our customers. What do I mean by sustainability-linked banking product? I mean, very simply, that at the banking relationship level, so not at the financing level, really the overall relationship with our customers, we want to bring them a menu with various ambitions, various KPIs, sustainability driven, which are sector specific, so meaningful for them. And one of those ambitions is SBT. So we want to engage a dialogue with all our corporate customers around what should you do, what could you do to move towards sustainability, highlighting specific dimensions, and one of them, and one of the major one, is SBT. And why SBT? Because as Kenza said, SBT has developed an SME route, as she called it, if I remember well, and that SME route is relatively straightforward for smaller players. So we really want to support smaller players to engage through SBT. Of course, larger players can do so as well and can benefit from it, but the ambition is really to go to all our customers with that. And by doing so, we aim to obviously make our financing book greener, but we also aim to make the overall Belgian society greener. And really, SBT is one of the key tools. So we have the same ambition. SBT and Belfius have the same ambition, bring sustainability to all, including the smaller SMEs. Voilà.
Great, thanks a lot, Florent. I think it's also super interesting to see what's the role of a bank to support all of its clients, not only the big ones but also the smaller ones, in raising the bar and fighting climate change and making sure that the Paris Agreement can be respected. So thanks a lot for your insights as well. I see we have 12 minutes left for questions and answers section. So there I hand over the floor to Fanny or Eglantine to ask a couple of the questions that came in through the chat box, and there were quite a lot. So Fanny, I leave the floor to you to direct the right questions to the right panelists.
Thank you so much. Yes, we had indeed a lot of questions popping up, especially for the first part of the presentation from Kenza. So we will start with a question to you then, Kenza, around, so how do you assess the consistency between the targets and the effective actions, basically? Sorry, I'm just trying to, oh my God, too many screens open at the same time. I'm sorry, but Kenza, can you come up with an answer for this one, please?
Yes, thanks. So basically what the SBTi is currently doing is asking companies to be able to or to disclose their and report on an annual basis, so that it would be easier for us to track the progress, not only for us but also for investors that are very interested in this. At the moment, this is the ask from companies, but as I mentioned during the presentation towards the end, we are currently developing an MRV project that will help us do this in a more, let's say, more professional and a deeper way.
Eglantine, can I please ask you to come up with the next question? I'm sorry, but my screen is completely frozen, so I can't really take the next one. I'm sorry.
For sure. So next question is, with regards to the supplier or customer engagement target, you mentioned that it should get a SBT within 5 years. From what I understood, it's sufficient to set SBT aligned targets and targets that meet the criteria. Sorry, the question is a bit long, but they don't necessarily have to submit them to the SBTi platform. Could you confirm that? This is a question from Jeroen Osman.
Thanks for this question. So yes, that's the short answer. Basically, we are asking companies to set a target, and within that target, it is a percentage of their suppliers that needs to set a target within 5 years. The suppliers do have to set a target that is aligned with the levels of decarbonization that are required, but they do not have to go through the SBTi to get them validated for the near-term targets, at least.
Next question from Julien Wellstein. Good morning. Could you provide us with an update on SBTi guidance for the oil and gas energy sector? Is it still expected to be available by the end of the year?
Good question. So the oil and gas project is still ongoing, and unfortunately, there's a little bit of lag in the timeline. So there will not be a guidance published in 2021. It will be published in the next year, hopefully in 2022.
We have another question from Sandrine Coutarel. Hi, what is the annual reduction needed if we choose absolute reduction targets?
So to be aligned with a 1.5 degree trajectory, this translates into a 4.2% reduction, absolute linear reduction.
Next question from Jacques-Olivier Garda on the new criteria. What about the companies that are already validated?
So companies that have validated targets, it actually depends if they were part of the business ambition for 1.5 degree campaign or not. If they were part of the business for ambition for 1.5 degree campaign, there is an FAQ available online that states exactly what companies need to do to align with the targets. But in general, there is a criterion that the SBTi has issued, and within that criterion, it says that all companies need to reassess and, if necessary, recalculate their targets every 5 years. So this is a requirement. Companies do not have to do that immediately when the new criteria come into force, but they have to look at when their target was validated and calculate 5 years from that to work on their new targets.
Another question from Vincent De Haas. For more information on SBTi for other sectors, such as airports, where could I reach out? Is there more direct guidance available?
So there is an aviation sector page on the SBTi website, and within there we have developed an SDA, so a sectoral decarbonization approach. That is currently well below 2 degrees aligned, and our technical teams are currently working on a new path that is 1.5 degree aligned with the aviation sector. So I would refer you to the guidance document.
A question from Alessandro Vannucci. What is an estimated cost for a company to start following the SBT approach?
So basically, the SBTi has a fee for the validation service, and the fee depends. The pricing structure has just been updated this week. The fee will depend on whether you're trying to validate one type of target, so either near term or long term, or both targets at the same time. There are packages for combined packages for 2 targets. But just to give you an idea, the validation for near-term targets or net zero targets alone is $9,500. And for a package deal, I invite you to check out our pricing structure that is available on the SBTI, so that it is more dependent on your specific case. For SMEs, there is a different pricing. So the fee is $1,000, and there is a waiver when it comes to SME companies that are from underdeveloped countries in general.
One more question for you, Kenza, and then I will have one for Viviana. But for you, is there a question? Sorry, how will SBT track progress? What if a company exceeds its linear reduction slightly for 1 or a couple of years?
So what the SBTI does is it looks at the overall time frame. So the targets that you have set over the entire time frame. If it's 10 years, then we look at what you've accomplished within the 10 years. We don't look specifically as at a specific year. So have you reduced this year and the next year and the following year? It is actually expected that there will be variations for all companies depending on what plan they have. So 1 year they could switch to renewable energy all in all. Another year they might not be able to reduce as much. So we will not look at if you've reached, for example, 4.2% in year 1, but we will look at if you've reached 42% reduction within the 10-year time frame.
Thank you very much, Kenza. And the last question is for Viviana. How does your approach complement with the expected EU taxonomy requirements? More widely, are those expected to be in line with SBTI?
So happy to take up this question. Well, at the moment, our portfolio is not under the green taxonomy, but of course, especially the SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, is is requiring right now, for example, to disclose greenhouse gas emissions for scope 1, 2, and 3 of your funds, of your products, in case you take the option of disclosing what it's called principal adverse impacts. So, KPIs on sustainability, like greenhouse gas emissions. So from that point of view, it's a kind of you're kind of forced to collect data on greenhouse gas emissions from your companies. To me, SBTI is a step further, is to set a climate target. Right now, let's say that's not under SFDR, but we have included anyhow as part of if you're familiar with that regulation, as part of the Article 8 characteristics. So the last 2 funds from Astorg are Article 8 funds promoting environmental and social characteristics, and the SBTI targets is one of these characteristics.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for all the questions. We tried to answer as many questions as possible, but with the little time remaining, we will close the session here today. So I thank you all very much for your time and for participating today and for all the very interesting questions. We will, of course, share the recordings and the slides at the end of this presentation. And of course, you have all the contacts also in this slide here. So don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any follow-on questions. For now, I wish you a very, very pleasant day. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. Bye-bye and take care.